My analysis of Exal Kressh is based around her lone appearance in the Old Republic Blood of the Empire miniseries, with background details drawn from the Old Republic Encyclopedia. My analyses of Asajj Ventress will be drawn purely from Legends continuity sources, the Clone Wars microseries, the Clone Wars novels, and the Dark Horse comics, ignoring her appearances in the Clone Wars animated series and all of its tie-ins. You know my reasons. I freely admit that I cranked this video out by using abridged versions of the full breakdowns for both characters from Exal Kressh vs Darth Wredd and Chaos and Darach vs Asajj Ventress. I really just wanted to get a video out. So with all of that out of the way, let us begin. Exal Kressh, the puppet apprentice of Emperor Vitiate, and Asajj Ventress, Count Dooku's enforcer. If these two noted adepts were to meet in single combat, who would win? Originally native to Korriban, the Sith purebloods were the dominant species within the Sith Empire, the descendants of the original Golden Age Sith. However, the title of pureblood was an ironic misnomer, as the modern Sith bloodlines were heavily diluted by interbreeding with humans. Though Exal could trace her lineage back to Ludo Kressh, the only Sith species traits that she retained were the red skin and yellow eyes, and she was otherwise a conventional humanoid female. In regards to physical performance, her prime stats were dexterity and agility, leveraged through one-handed blade work and nimble footwork. Her demonstrated endurance was respectable, tanking blaster fire to the back with the aid of her scavenged smuggler's armor, and shrugging off an abdominal kick delivered by Teneb Kel. However, though Kressh was perfectly capable of digging in and slugging it out, her strength wasn't truly tested against Kel. Standing at medium height and boasting an athletic build, Kressh swapped out her traditional Sith robes for appropriated smuggler's garb. Beneath the mantled overcoat, she wore bracers, a chest piece, and armored boots, with everything else composed of heat-resistant fabrics, likely armor weave. Though intended to be inconspicuous rather than imposing, the emphasis on concealment and mobility meshed well with her more skill-based approach to combat. And at the end of the day, Exal Kresh's greatest asset was her strength in the Force, experiencing her greatest success when keeping her distance and leveraging this power. Despite their infamy as brutal warriors, the Radataki were distinguished only by cosmetic traits, their pale skin and scant body hair, and they were otherwise baseline humanoids. Youthful and athletic, Asajj Ventress was a lifelong fighter, personally distinguished by the black slash tattoos on either side of her head, a death count of rival warlords. As a physical combatant, Ventress's primary attributes were agility and dexterity, leveraged through her nimble gymnastics and her handling of dual blades. An exceptional endurance fighter, she had a high tolerance for pain and injury, continuing to fight after being battered against the stone walls of the Yavin Temple. However, her emphasis on dexterity was forced by her lack of strength. Despite her hardiness, Ventress cannot handle a slugging match, simply because she can't hold her ground, which allowed Anakin Skywalker to overpower her defenses on multiple occasions. Ventress capitalized on her strongest attributes by keeping herself unencumbered, opting for a form-fitting Sullustan leather jumpsuit. She completed the outfit with heavy boots and gloves, while a combat skirt obscured her profile. Instead of trying to tank hits, she relied on evasion, with the jumpsuit protecting against the abrasive battlefield. However, though the bodysuit was practical in the field with a maximum range of motion, it provided no actual protection. Asajj Ventress's success was ultimately predicated on her ability to keep opponents at bay and off balance. Sith purebloods typically boast a more resilient physiology compared to baseline humanoids, but Kresh's Sith blood is so watered down that the only traits she retains are cosmetic. Kressh is by no means a pushover, but compared to Ventress, her showings are decidedly unexceptional. Much of this clearly comes down to different training focuses, as Ventress is a dedicated physical combatant, where Kressh is decidedly more force-focused. To be fair to Kressh, despite her more conservative demonstrations, I would rate her overall physical performance as comparable to Ventress, meaning that she would still contend evenly. Both are dexterous dancers who prefer to keep opponents at arm's length, avoiding the direct contests of strength that they are sure to lose. Their choice of armor reflects this approach, emphasizing mobility over protection. Kresh's blast-dampening smuggler's garb provides greater protection, but it isn't lightsaber resistant, therefore failing to provide any advantage in a duel. Ultimately, the deciding factor is discipline, which Kressh lacks, due to Vitiate's corrosive influence. Where Exal Kressh merely lashes out, Asajj Ventress has persevered under fire, earning her the edge. Exal Kresh's role as Emperor Vitiate's retrieval agent entailed a strong focus on combat, and given the degree to which she outclassed Teneb Kel, she was clearly an experienced duelist. However, the bulk of her experience consisted merely of terrorizing the defenseless and causing havoc, known to have perpetrated the massacre of the native tribes of Lenico and destroying the Lenico Colony Blue Station merely to keep Kel tied up. Armed with a standard Sith lightsaber fitted with a synthetic ruby, Kresh's lightsaber technique was defined by her preference for one-handed blade work and linear fencing postures, though she favored simple hack-and-slash strikes, occasionally adopting a reversed grip while using her free offhand for combat casting. This refined yet simplified style pointed to a background in Makashi and Naiman, while her focused aggression and dark side channeling strongly suggested a specialization in Juyo, the ferocity form. Though a formidable aggressor, her compromised defenses and tunnel vision allowed Teneb Kel to land an abdominal kick, after Kressh was blindsided by his slave, Maggot. She compensated for these shortcomings with extensive strategic planning, and by adopting a hit-and-run attack pattern. The effectiveness of these tactics was demonstrated in her first confrontation with Teneb Kel on board Lenico Colony Blue, where she used her control of the environment to harass and herd Kel. However, when dropped into a fight cold, her shortcomings came back with a vengeance, demonstrated in her rematch with Kel in the Korriban Tombs. Her total fixation on her opponent left her vulnerable to attacks from other vectors, which led to her death. Asajj Ventress was originally trained by Jedi Knight Kai Narek, who instructed her in the use of the traditional weapon of his order, with Ventress adopting dual blades after his death. Noted for her impressive lightsaber skills by Darth Sidious before her training with Count Dooku even began, her skills were further elevated by the Count's training in classical lightsaber techniques. In addition, Dooku also provided her with the unique specialist weapons that became iconic to Ventress, the conjoining set of curved fencing lightsabers originally constructed by Komari Vosa, projecting Sith bloodshine blades. In order to accommodate the twin blades and prevent them from tangling, Ventress employed wide circular sweeps and flourishes, using gymnastic rotations to maneuver the two weapons, but favoring quite relaxed movements and postures, relying almost entirely on dexterity over strength. My belief is that Kyneric trained Ventress in Ataru and Nyman, two of the most common forms within the Jedi Order, the former supporting her integration of hand-to-hand combat techniques, and the latter her integration of offensive force abilities, and both including a dual saber component. This technique was then elevated and focused by Dooku's training in Makashi and classical Jarkai. Ventress was an extremely capable swordswoman, her jack-of-all-trades skill set covering all of her bases. She supplemented her potent lightsaber skills with subversive tactics and psychological warfare, breaking the opponent's composure with theatrical posturing and verbal taunts, while changing the rules of the engagement by cycling through the various techniques in her arsenal. However, like Dooku, her almost purely dexterity-based technique was poorly suited for combating more strength-oriented fighting forms, and her style was effectively crippled by the loss of one of her blades. Starting from the top, Asajj Ventress has a significant advantage straight out of the gate, courtesy of her specialized weapon set, which allows her to leverage her entire skill set in a way that Kressh simply can't. Assuming that I'm correct about their training specializations, then this disparity carries over to their style configurations. Where Kressh blended her repertoire of forms into a singular technique, Ventress pulled specific components from each of the forms in her arsenal to give her style layers. Both use dexterity-based fencing styles supported by nimble footwork and acrobatics, intended to keep opponents at arm's length and subvert their defenses. However, Ventress is simply functioning on a higher level, her use of dual blades boosting her output and reinforcing her blade-binding techniques, while her physical combat integration provides an additional attack vector that Kressh has no answer for. Though Ventress's style is crippled by the loss of one of her blades, Kressh can't capitalize on this due to the skill differential. Their tactics are extremely similar, both using roving retreats through hazardous environments to weather their opponents. However, Ventress's greater ability to improvise made her tactics more consistent, where Kressh relied on pre-planning, or resorted to direct offense when dropped in cold. Furthermore, though both were unstable and prone to raging, Vitiate's overbearing influence left Kressh significantly more volatile and unhinged. Ultimately, the true deciding factor is background. Exal Kressh was trained by a reigning Sith ritual master, who regarded lightsaber combat as a tedious necessity, where Asajj Ventress was trained by a reigning Sith sword master with a passion for lightsaber dueling, this superior instruction earning her a decisive edge. As the apprentice to Emperor Vitiate, arguably the greatest Sith ritual master in galactic history, Exal Kressh was virtually guaranteed a comprehensive education in the dark arts, especially given her role as Vitiate's deep lore retrieval agent. As a Sith Inquisitor, Kresh's primary tools in battle were her force abilities. With telekinesis, her kinetic output was sufficient to shatter a stone pillar with a force push, and she demonstrated the ability to manipulate multiple objects at a time when she force-choked 3 targets simultaneously while hurling back 2 of them. Though her passive barrier was never tested, her active force shield was powerful enough to pulverize the flurry of crystalline permaglass shards hurled by Teneb Kel. Kresh's favorite combative ability by far was Force Lightning, hers being powerful enough to kill multiple targets and leave victims with disfiguring burns. Most impressively, when Kel attempted to absorb the energy with his saber staff, Kresh's lightning instead overloaded and destroyed the weapon. Her typical approach was to open with force abilities and harass her opponents from a distance. Her use of the aerosol droids to herd Tenebkel during their battle in the Cryostasis Bay demonstrated her ability to encompass and control engagements by controlling the environment, and she was likely capable of producing a similar result with telekinesis, a possibility glimpsed when she hurled the debris from the shattered pillar at Kel. As the first child of the Emperor, all of Kresh's showings with telepathic abilities related to how she grappled with this connection. Though constantly subject to Vitiate's projected thoughts and emotional manipulation, she was strong enough to resist his direct control. However, the Sith Emperor's subversive influence was constantly eroding her sanity, which left her emotionally unstable and bloodthirsty. When she rages, she regresses to physical combat, and though this anger feeds her dark side channeling and bolsters physical enhancement, it also means that she fails to make full and effective use of all of her powers. Despite her aborted Jedi training due to Kai Nerrick's death, Asajj Ventress was already a capable Force warrior when Dooku recruited her. As the foremost of his Dark acolytes, she was provided with rudimentary training in the Sith arts, though she ultimately remained a simple, albeit powerful Dark Jedi. An exceptionally skilled telekinetic, Ventress's lifting strength was several tons, demonstrated when she hurled a massive stone pillar at Anakin Skywalker on Yavin 4, while her fine control was shown when she pelted Skywalker with a barrage of flagstones plucked from the Massassi Temple. She also demonstrated a form of limited levitation when she engaged in a mid-air lightsaber duel with Dooku. As she operated primarily as an assassin, she was highly adept at Force concealment, her skills in this area heightened by Dooku's training in the Sith Kuei Tech meditation, which allowed her to conceal her Force signature even from powerful Jedi Masters. During her confrontation with Obi-Wan Kenobi on board the Titavian 4, Ventress used Beast Trick to take control of the Rancor he loosed, turning his own distraction tactic against him. Most impressively, she animated the bodies of dead Gungans on Oma-Dun as puppet soldiers, likely an example of the same Sith sorcery that created the Korriban zombies that guarded the Valley of the Dark Lords. Ventress wielded her powers extremely proactively, but only cut loose as a last resort, favoring maximum return for minimal effort. Her Force abilities were a major component in her subversion tactics, keeping opponents off balance by controlling the environment. On Yavin 4, she successfully blindsided Anakin Skywalker with thrown objects, though she did walk a fine line between simply goading him and actually provoking him. Ultimately, as skilled and focused as Asajj Ventress was, she simply could not contend with superior power in the Force. I am firmly of the opinion that Vitiate's influence on Kressh leaves her especially vulnerable to telepathic interference from other sources, and though Ventress's active telepathic powers aren't sufficient to capitalize on this, it does make Ventress's use of Force concealment more effective, enabling her hit-and-run tactics. However, even without any such third-party interference, Kresh's unhinged nature resulted in a less-than-ideal application of power while she vented with physical combat. Her success was predicated on a strong battle plan, and failing that, overwhelming power. Though Ventress has more showings, I would rate Kresh's use of baseline physical enhancement as comparable, especially as both are amping themselves further with Dark Rage, though only Ventress has been shown overclocking her performance completely with Force speed. However, not all of Ventress's additional skills provide any true advantage, her Sith hibernation techniques simply improving her survivability when grievously injured. Neither was capable of Tuta Minis, but this was only a weakness for Ventress, especially so given how powerful Kresh's Force Lightning is. Their skill and magnitude with offensive telekinesis was directly comparable, both employing many common tactics and tricks, though Kressh's active force shield covered her defensive bases more effectively. As to how their passive defenses stack up, I see them as roughly on par, both capable of using simple force pushes against one another, but nothing more involved than that. Given Kressh's background and knowledge base, Ventress's minor Sith sorcery powers would be completely useless, at best merely stalling Kressh, at worst playing to her advantage. Both were trained as disposable agents rather than true apprentices, but Kressh was at least a true Sith Lord, with everything that entailed, where Ventress remained a mere Dark Jedi with minor Sith training. Just as the Swordmaster Dooku provided Asajj Ventress with superior instruction in lightsaber combat, the Ritual Master Vitiate provided Exal Kressh with superior instruction in the ways of the Force, earning her the decisive advantage. The most significant difference between Exal Kressh and Asajj Ventress is their training focus, Kressh being heavily force-focused and Ventress heavily lightsaber-focused. But beyond this, they were very similar fighter types with many common tactics and tricks, both being dexterous dancers who kept their opponents at arm's length with delicate fencing styles while subverting them with force integration. Even their shortcomings were of a similar nature, their emotional baggage leaving them unstable and prone to raging. However, though Kressh was by no means a pushover, she wasn't a proven warrior like Ventress, and had never truly experienced the meat grinder of hard combat. Due to these demands, Ventress was a significantly more experienced and developed swordswoman, her skills further elevated by her specialized weapon set. But on the other hand, the different demands placed upon Kressh by Vitiate resulted in substantially greater skill and power with the Force, where Ventress's growth in this area was specifically restricted by Dooku in order to keep her under his thumb. Quite simply, Exal Kressh wielded the powers of a true Sith Lord, where Asajj Ventress did not. The success of both was predicated on tactical ingenuity, and as mentioned, both were undermined in this area by emotional instability. However, Kressh's constantly eroding sanity left her much worse off in this regard, and she only demonstrated clever strategy when allowed to pre-plan battles, and otherwise she simply vented on the opponent. By contrast, Ventress's baggage was rooted in childhood trauma, and her composure was only compromised when specific buttons were pushed. Furthermore, she was much better at thinking on her feet and improvising. Given Kressh's tendency to revert to direct assault when dropped in cold, this battle is likely to begin as a lightsaber duel, which begs the question as to whether Ventress could outfence Kressh before she wised up and cut loose with her powers. My answer, possible but unlikely, which leads to the following question as to whether Kressh could immediately one-shot Ventress with Force Lightning. Again, possible but unlikely. Ventress has only been subdued by sustained barrages, where Kressh favors quick bursts, and the possible destruction of one of her blades isn't a completely fatal setback for Ventress. When faced with opponents she couldn't defeat head-to-head, Ventress typically broke off and switched over to stealth and ambush tactics, goading enemies into pursuing her while subverting them with abrupt hit-and-run counters. If Kressh kept her wits about her, she'd respond in kind, and in such an engagement Kresh's greater power would give her the dominant edge. But between Kresh's compromised mental state and Ventress's psychological warfare tactics, we all know that Kressh would not keep her wits about her. Instead of running a successful search and destroy campaign, Kressh would simply hulk out and nuke the arena with area effect abilities. Due to Kresh's power, any mistake on Ventress's part would be rewarded with immediate and painful death. making this fight extremely close. But Kressh's blind rage gives Ventress the openings she needs to stay out of her crosshairs and blindside her. In fact, I'd argue that Kressh's extreme threat level actually plays to Ventress's advantage by forcing her to dispense with the gloating, stay focused, and one-shot Kressh at the earliest opportunity. The desperation tactic that allowed Lieutenant Kell to take down Exal Kressh would be a deliberate tactic in the hands of Asajj Ventress. I declare Asajj Ventress the victor. And now to the post-mortem analyses, where I provide my assessment of both combatants and where they stand relative to other fighters. Starting from the top with Exal Kressh, I rate her as possessing a Tier 3 physique. Her athleticism is unquestionable, but all she's bringing on is agility and dexterity. She was no pushover, but neither was she particularly domineering. Much like Darth Zana, Kressh capitalized on her youth and her strongest attributes to become a formidable close combatant, but she was no heavyweight, and her success most assuredly was not predicated on physical supremacy. As a duelist, I also rate Kressh as a Tier 3. She clearly pulled from multiple sources when building her style, but she blended them into a singular specialized technique. Kressh is directly analogous to Inquisitor Darach, having mastered lightsaber combat out of necessity rather than enthusiasm. Her technique merely intended to mop up lower-level enemies while stalling for time against higher-level duelists. Impressive, but unexceptional. As a Force wielder, I place Kressh as Tier 1.5. Given her heritage and pedigree, exceptional talent with the Force was practically guaranteed. Training from Emperor Vitiate allowed her to develop to a very high level. Not god tier, but a powerhouse in her own right, bumping shoulders with Dooku and Darach. Based purely upon her developed skill set and tactics, I rate Exal Kressh as an overall Tier 2. She possesses an excellent balance between lightsaber and Force combat, leveraging her entire skill set to adapt to changing situations. Rather than dominate purely through brute force, she favored subversion and ambush, keeping opponents at arm's length and weathering them. Quite simply, Kressh was a Force duelist in the mold of Inquisitor Darach. During her apprenticeship, I suspect that her connection to Vitiate as a child of the Emperor was initially beneficial, with Vitiate presumably functioning as a Force-based strategic overwatch. However, when she rebelled, things turned ugly, and she was badly undercut by his corrosive influence, resulting in a circumstantial rating of Tier 3. Her compromised mental state led to escalating berserker rages, and she took to wielding her powers as cudgels. Rather than dominating through skill and subversion, she became an offensive dervish similar to TCW Maul. Moving on to Asajj Ventress, I also rate her as possessing a Tier 3 physique, and for many of the same reasons. Ventress may be a dedicated and proven physical combatant, but all she's bringing on is agility and dexterity. Due to her lack of strength, she folds under pressure, despite her impressive tolerance for pain and injury. She's a formidable close combatant, but her success is predicated on skill. As a duelist, Ventress is a Tier 2 in the making Tier 3, employing a layered fighting style optimized for dueling and bolstered by a versatile weapon set, though ultimately restricted by a lack of development and lingering practical weaknesses in certain areas. She could contend evenly with Kenobi and Skywalker, but unlike them, she was completely and consistently overmatched by Dooku. As a Force wielder, I again place Asajj Ventress as a Tier 3. She's an impressively powerful strategic operative with a practical and comprehensive skill set, but she's again restricted by a lack of development and lingering practical weaknesses in certain areas. Here, Ventress has been very pointedly restricted by Dooku. in order to keep her under his thumb. Ventress's overall rating of Tier 3 should come as no surprise. She boasts an excellent balance between lightsaber and force combat, leveraging her entire skill set to adapt to changing situations, but is restricted by a lack of development and specific holes in her skill set. She's essentially a pure Jedi Hunter build similar to Galen Merrick, capable of contending with even the most powerful Jedi, but of limited effectiveness against Sith. Though just as prone to raging as Kressh, Ventress retains her Tier 3 effectiveness, as her combat performance remains consistent, even if her tactics suffer. Exal Kresh's greater strength in the Force aside, she and Asajj Ventress possessed a similar level of development and a similar balance of attributes. Despite their opposing skill configurations, both were strategic operatives who dominated through subversion by controlling the environment. However, both were emotionally unstable and prone to raging, which occasionally compromised their effectiveness.